For those guests that are online waiting, if you wouldn't mind putting in the chat, maybe some of your experiences with online trainings, how they've been going for you, some best practices, maybe some inquiry that you might have for the panelists. We're all with Embodied Philosophy, an online certification program focused around yoga. And if you have questions about yoga, put them in the chat. We might have some space for that as well. And Stephanie and Dr. Marcy, so that we definitely have time for the conversation we want to have. If you don't mind, I'll do introductions for the three of us, and then Dr. Raj should be joining in. Thank you everyone for joining us, being present, giving us grace with this technology, what we're here to talk about. My name is Kiesha Battles, and I'll be a moderator for our presentation today. I'll introduce myself in a moment. I'm grateful for Dr. Marcy Goldstein, who actually came up with this idea to present at the conference today. And Dr. Marcy Goldstein is a PhD, began teaching Sanskrit and the history and philosophy of yoga in the 1990s. Dr. Marcy has designed her courses and draws from her academic training and 20 years of yoga practice. At UNC Charlotte, she teaches yoga through the ages, and she's created Sanskrit Revolution. She's taught at more than 3 dozen yoga studios and teacher training programs, conferences and festivals, and that has definitely expanded through these virtual spaces we've been in. Her passion is to help people discover the history and fascinating linguistic foundation of yoga. Welcome, Dr. Marcy. Stephanie Corigliano, Humboldt State University, an adjunct professor in the Religious Studies Department and an independent lecturer. Stephanie is an authorized teacher of Ashtanga Yoga in the tradition of K. Pattabhi Jois and a daily practitioner since 1999. Mother of 2 active boys, and maintains a 20-acre homestead in Northern California where she tends to bees and grows a variety of fruits and vegetables. Stephanie also brings us the administrative side of Embodied Philosophy. So if you have questions about the programming, she's definitely the one to connect with. Dr. Raj, so grateful that you are here with us and the technology entered you in the space. I'm just giving introductions, and you are right on time as always. Dr. Raj Balkaran, founder and School of Indian Wisdom. Dr. Raj is a prolific scholar of Indian mythology, having authored The Goddess and the King in Indian Myth, The Goddess and the Sun in Indian Myth, and several other academic articles and books. And he has one coming up soon, which I'm sure he'll share some gems with. He's also a spiritual adept, having been initiated into ancient Indian wisdom traditions by multiple masters, engaged in daily practices for 2 decades. A seasoned online educator, he teaches at Yogic Studies in the Oxford Center for Hindu Studies, where he also serves on the course development board. Stephanie, Dr. Raj, Dr. Marcy, and then I'm Kiesha Battles. I am a student of Embodied Philosophy. I'm also an adjunct professor at Bennett College, HBCU, historically Black college here in Charlotte, North Carolina. I've been studying yoga for over 20 years, have a master's degree in Asian studies, and similar to some of you students, have gone through a master's program, not necessarily focused on yoga as we know it today, but focused on the philosophy, the language, the history of the practice. Thank you for having our panel here today. And Caitlin, thank you for serving as technical moderator. If you have any questions with technology, please put them into the chat. Caitlin will definitely assist you. Now that we've gone through our introductions, let's get into the heart of our roundtable. Again, this is Embodied Philosophy and talking about online learning. To get us started, I'd like to direct to Dr. Raj, if you would please define with us, share with us, story tell with us What is embodied philosophy?
So to begin, I'd like to have a bit of an experiential touch right at the outset. If you're so inclined, feel free to enter a nice, a relaxed space, be as centered as you can. Perhaps my voice will induce a slight hypnotic state. You never know. I'm just going to issue a couple of ancient Vedic chants. We can talk about the chants and what they mean and how they work. But for now, just have an experience. Allow them to wash over you. Chant along if you'd like. And then I will confine my remarks to no more than 5 minutes so as to leave plenty of space for engagement. Om Gananam Dva Ganapati Gum Havamahe Kavim Gavinam Upamashravastamam Jeshtarajam Brahmanam Brahmanasmadanaha Shrinvano Debhisi Dasadanam Lambodharaya Namaha Ekarandaya Namaha Vigna Vinashine Namaha Om Namo Devyai Mahadevyai Shivaye Satatam Namaha Nama Prakrite Bhadraye Niyathaha Nanathaha Smadham Om Triambakam Yajamahe Sugandhim Pushtivardhanam Urvarukamiva Bandhanan Mrityor Mukshiyamamritat Om Shanti 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 Shri Guru Bhyo Namaha. So for thousands of years, the wisdom of ancient India has been transmitted from one to the other, literally parampara. The word parampara means one, from one to the other. It's synonymous with vamsha or lineage or line, a line of transmission. And that line persists to this day. The teachers are secondary, the students are secondary, the knowledge is primary to be transmitted to benefit teachers and students alike. And this transmission occurred within the riverbed, this river flowed within the riverbed of a very strong, tight-knit, intimate relationship born of trust, integrity, authenticity, the relationship between student and teacher. There are those on this earth fortunate enough to be born into the correct circumstance and have the correct karmic constitution so as to be part of this link and this type of pedagogical process. There are those who are trained in the art of preparing sumptuous Indian cuisine. And then there are those like us who dine at the Indian buffet. And so how do we transplant the parampara to the online world? How do we facilitate embodied experience as if your guru was right in front of you while we are miles and continents apart? My experiments in online education has led me to teaching at Embodied Philosophy, among other places, as well as founding a school called the School of Indian Wisdom. Indian wisdom is living. It's not about the content. It's about the realization of the content. It's not about information. We are in the information age, and yet we are so spiritually bankrupt. It's about transformation, not information. And so clearly one can derive some wisdom, some living wisdom at the school. I'm redefining for myself and my students the power of parampara in the online space, the extent to which we can be intimate and engage in impactful, transformational, experiential learning through the online means. What is embodied philosophy? What does it mean to feel a truth in your being? What does it mean to feel something in your bones? What does it mean to realize something and not know it intellectually? This sort of realization is something that one can gain from lineal transmissions, whether in person across the table from a teacher, or whether across the keyboard in a Zoom room. We are defining and redefining what is needed, what is necessary, what is possible in this brave new world of ours, where one's kith and kin are spread out across the world. And so I encourage you to consider the extent to which the power of these teachings, the extent to which transformation and embodied learning, Parampara 2.0, is possible through the online medium. And with that, I'll turn the floor over to my esteemed colleagues to delve deeply into 3 important questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Raj, for giving us the embodiment with the chanting in the beginning, to feel the vibration, to feel the connection, and grounding us all in community. Even if we're not virtually seeing one another, we're feeling the experience. Stephanie, first official question pointed towards you. What is the role of community in the online learning space? If you would please share.
Thank you, Kiesha, and thank you, Raj, for your opening statements, and all of you for being in attendance. It's nice to have this space together. So part of my project that I bring or hope for our time together here is to think productively together about some of these ideas and to really generate some conversation. I've been working with embodied philosophy now for about 4 years. And so I have some experience with that online platform that I'm bringing into the room, but also with a full awareness that there's a lot of room to grow. And this technology and the spaces and how we're using the online world is really new. And so in hoping to, create new avenues and thinking, together about what works and what doesn't work. So as a way of, the question I'm working with here is, what is the role of community in online learning spaces? But as a way of opening, I'd like to ask each of you to just reflect for a moment on where has community been important in your life and work? Where has community been important in your life and work? And just holding in mind a couple of examples, because I'm sure each of us have something, examples from different parts of our lives where community has had an influence in that way. Then we'll move towards considering how might that translate to an online space. I'd offer out that community is not always harmonious, that sometimes community arises out of shared questions or concerns. I personally live in a small community. And so sometimes we interact mostly when there are problems, when we are interacting over the, through the time of COVID, as being a part of a school board or something, we have, most people show up when there's a real hotly debated issue to debate and discuss. And sometimes when there are no problems, nobody shows up, and you don't actually have that sense of community in the same way you do when, say, the power is out, or any other set of examples. Community can be a place to debate. It can be a space where you're held accountable indifferently than you might be when you're on your own. And it's a place to meet challenges. It can also be a place of general support. So then turning towards yoga community, which offers a different set of expectations, I think about what is a yoga community. And this presents its own set of challenges because yoga is inherently a very diverse set of practitioners. And so we have guru-led communities that might share certain doctrinal precepts. We have the brick and mortar yoga shalas that have served communities historically, especially prior to the pandemic, of a place to gather, maybe have potlucks or share kirtan. And we have, we might share common questions. So there might be a community of scholars. And so this is, I guess, kind of where I'm moving with the, just a moment. I have a 12-year-old that's trying to interrupt me. No, please stop. Okay, sorry about that. He chose this moment to linger outside my window waving his arms. So some practical approaches. So I came back to this question of what is a yoga community, and I brought up the community of scholars, which is really where maybe embodied philosophy is particularly the special angle that embodied philosophy offers, is we've brought in this question of, or a project of the scholar practitioner. So I think that there is a community of scholars. I noticed that last night I logged on to hear the opening bits from this conference here with honoring Deepa Mehta. And I saw a number of familiar names, much of the same community that shows up at the Donham meetings that I've seen. The Dharma Academy of North America is also here for this conference. So there is a way that we interact as scholars and as practitioners in different spaces, and we get to see familiar names and faces in that way. So the community forms in these different ways. When we're in the online spaces, some of the practical approaches, I guess my questions come up, what can make this work? And sometimes it might be having screens on, so we have a sense of getting to see people's faces. Although admittedly, when I signed on last night to listen to the opening lectures, I didn't have my screen on. It was in the safety of, my home and maybe not a great place to have the screen on. So I completely understand as adults, we move into spaces in different ways. And yet screens on is something that's really had an impact in my relationship with those that I work with at Embodied Philosophy, having a sense of people's faces and they're showing up and really being present for a conversation. Breakout rooms have obviously been an effective way to have that personal connection. For the Yoga Philosophy Certificate Program, we've introduced monthly integration sessions that offer a little bit more of that time for a breakout room and conversation. And we have a project that all of the students work towards with that kind of helps, maybe presents one of these challenges or crises that, like I mentioned, that might happen in a regular community, that you have to come up with your final project. Suddenly you're turning to your peers and waiting for that kind of challenge. So that's a little backdrop and towards the various dynamics and aspects or ways that community might function. And I'm curious to hear from those of you that are here, what's worked for you in the online space? What has been the most effective forms? And what do you want from an online community? What would be helpful in an online community, I guess, is a way of opening the conversation.
So guess we're opening it up for discussion. You could use raise hand functions if you like that. You can be on chat. You can be off screen. You can come on screen. You can simply unmute yourself. How are things going for you in the virtual space?
Is it important for you to have a community when you're learning, or is that an aside? Is that not as important to you?
I'll jump in. Oh, I think I'm echoing. Okay. So I joined the master's program right when COVID hit. So we've been online for most of my time here, and it's been challenging. It really has been. The adjustment to not only doing yoga online, but just making connections with individuals online as well. But at the same time, it's also been pretty enlightening in that I've been exposing myself more to the ways that technology is able to connect us. So it's been challenging, yet nice at the same time.
Thanks, Caitlin. I'm curious, do you have, because obviously you meet for classes over Zoom, do you have time that you have discussion groups over Zoom?
Yes, we will do breakout rooms occasionally. Only this past fall, we were allowed to come onto campus, but we had about half and half. Half of the students would come on, the other half would attend online. But our last year, it was pretty much all online, and we had breakout rooms for just about every class. So we were able to discuss and get to know each other a little bit here and there.
I'd actually like to answer the question that Dr. Raj said is how important is an online community for learning? And Stephanie, this will apply to the embodied philosophy. I joined the program before COVID, and at that time, community wasn't important. It was to get the knowledge, to hear the knowledge from Dr. Marcy, to study, to continue to grow in that aspect. And then when COVID came around, then the online learning experience shifted and community was a big part. To be in a space with like-minded people, or to be in a space where people were sharing some of the challenges that they were having, sharing additional resources. So presently now with things shifting, I'm in North Carolina, we have a lot of in-person stuff as well as virtual going on. I'm finding myself drawn still to the online communities for checking in, for being with people, for going a little bit deeper than what we're doing outside of those spaces. So I found a big need for it, and it is actually propelled into a lot of my other teachings, and we're able to connect to the communities that aren't able to get back in person, like our senior populations, those with mobility challenges. So it's creating almost like a gathering space where we're still learning, but also communing. Marcia says in the chat, I have found that during my current 300 YTT training, we have been fortunate to create a sense of community by having a check-in before each weekend session, which is enhanced with social media tools such as the WhatsApp app, also having a study buddy from the group. Open to other voices.
Yeah, I was just going to add to something that Caitlin said, and it just seems like such fortuitous timing, actually, because Zoom had kind of gotten off the ground a little bit, and thankfully so, because if when COVID hit, we didn't have this space established, then it would have been even more isolating by far. I remember at the time I was Googling, when I was very unfamiliar with Zoom when COVID hit, but I remember looking it up, and I think it was founded about 7 years ago, or it was 7 years before COVID, something like that. And I thought, well, that lined up really well, because this would be way more horrific if we couldn't gather like this. I remember feeling like it was a lifesaver for me, because I could still connect with my students mostly. It was like, it was just the silver lining, I suppose.
Thank you, Dr. Marcy. It definitely has brought about accessibility.
It's a great observation. It's hard. I've never actually entertained that. What would this all have been like if we hadn't had something like Zoom to connect? We hear so much about Zoom fatigue, at least I do, in teaching undergraduates. In the university setting, people are just, tired of being on Zoom and this kind of, so a lot of times it's disparaging talk, but would not be possible without our level of connectivity would have been really radically different, and ability to stay connected and have those conversations. I was curious, Maria mentioned something about using WhatsApp as a social media tool, such as WhatsApp, to stay connected with others. I'm wondering if that's just using like group chats or that kind of thing to be able to stay connected and have conversation with students before the weekend. I guess that in some ways those are the kind of tools that I'm curious about how people are using with, say, a larger, like a teacher training group or a larger program. What is effective? Because we've used things like discussion groups on Facebook or Facebook Messenger. I've seen groups gather with particular thread or a group to have ongoing conversation about a topic or something like that. Interestingly, this year, our yoga philosophy certificate program has done less online discussion than in previous years, where it's less of kind of a discussion setting on the Facebook. And it's actually been something that some of the like the Facebook space that's set up just for that group has just for some reason been less active. And so it's kind of a question of how do you create those casual conversations, the kind of things that might happen in the hallway or when you grab coffee before class or something like that, that you happen to run into people. In some ways, those are some of the really meaningful moments, and yet, social media has a way of sometimes dampening that or making it feel less authentic or, less human.
Stephanie, I'll add on, I know Marcia directly, and the use of the WhatsApp app is for about a group of 10 people. And I believe the use of the app came about because of accessibility. Most of the group is in the United States, and we had one person in Senegal, Africa. So that tool in itself made it accessible. Then there's a Google Classroom where you're able to put documents and chat in the Google Classroom. And then there's, of course, stepping outside of that space, old school, and literally texting and calling people, coming out of the Zoom space and having phone conversations with people in the smaller spaces. I have noticed, like you have noticed, that in the Facebook chats, the groups that I've been in, the activity has lessened a lot since the beginning of COVID in that space. And I don't know if that's just the overall trend where folks are shifting from Facebook because there's so much information and news and moving more towards the Instagram where it's instant gratification for the eyes. So that might just be an overall trend or part of that fatigue of there's just too much information coming through Facebook. But what I just experienced in general, multiple tools based upon the group that I'm with. WhatsApp for this group, Facebook for this group. Some groups are saying, don't call me, pick up the phone. So it's really just shifting based upon energy.
That makes a lot of sense, actually, in terms of how Facebook can be such a kind of can of worms opening something like that, but having a much more focused space like a Google Classroom, or where your discussions actually happen in a really more of a container, and that intimacy almost of actually having a phone call is another aspect of actually having that direct, even a text message or picking up the phone is really valuable as a complement to the overall picture.
In my own teaching, I have created some Facebook groups for external conversation in addition to the live Zooms. And I found that there's some people who despise Facebook and for political reasons don't have an account and don't even want an account for the limited time of our training. So I have thought that maybe that's not the best place to gather because it excludes some people, and maybe Google Classroom or some other platform might be a more neutral place to go.
Some platforms, so some sort of drag and drop platforms, such as, I use at the School of Indian Wisdom, I use a platform called Kajabi. It's the same that they use at Yogic Studies. They also have community features. So sort of a closed space for that platform where you can go and share and post, but it's just within that platform. And therefore the students who sign up for courses, and one can decide, how large the groups are and whatnot, and set it up. And just a quick note about Zoom. Interestingly enough, I started teaching online, and to be honest, I was a real skeptic. I went from a skeptic to believer to now preaching the good news about online teaching. But I started in 2017, and Zoom was the best option for online education. So if you can believe it, by 2020, I was working from my home office, teaching online on Zoom for 3 years. And so once the pandemic hit, it just made a whole lot more sense. So yeah, it is fortuitous that Zoom came before the pandemic and not after.
Stephanie, you had another element of what you shared in regards to what works with being on screen and off screen. I know recently I have come into spaces where being off screen creates accessibility. So considering the students, and specifically like my younger students, my son who's in high school, there's the thing of making it accessible where they're off camera so that they're not feeling like their home environment isn't appropriate to be on camera, or they might be in a living space with other people. So sometimes this on camera takes away the accessibility for people to participate. So I'd like to kind of throw that into the question. How is on screen, off screen working for the folks that are in our space. An example too, accessibility. Last night, Stephanie, I was with you. I was listening to the music, but I was cooking dinner. It allowed me to enjoy what was going on, but still then serve my family and prepare to be in this Zoom today, where typically I wouldn't be able to experience it because now I'm focused on one thing. So it definitely opens things up, but then it can also limit it as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I was in the same boat with you yesterday evening, and I know also in terms of, elementary education, when in our area, when Zoom school really first opened, many people didn't have super high connectivity. So, Zoom with cameras on takes more bandwidth, and, connections would be delayed, and it was hard. You couldn't expect everyone to have a camera on. They were lucky if they could just hear what was happening. But it does also invite this whole, there is just something different, I guess, about not being able to see people's faces and not know who's with you in the room. And so accessibility, yeah, it does open this whole other window. And many times when I pop into a lecture or attend a conference, I wouldn't be there if I couldn't just have my camera off, because I don't have, like, as working and multitasking the way we all do, sometimes it's just impossible. And yet you do lose some of that intimacy or the sense of connection between individuals, but maybe that's acceptable, that you're still participating to some degree, and you'll show up when you need to.
Yeah, I had that experience recently in a training where a student was just, I think, kind of having a bad day or just not in a great space. But I think that if she didn't have, and she asked to take her camera off, and I thought, well, if she didn't have that option, she might have just logged off completely. So it was a way for her to be present in as much capacity as she could kind of handle, I think, at that time. So I think it's really welcoming to maybe encourage people to turn their cameras on, but also be completely welcoming if and when people need to turn it off.
Thank you, Dr. Marcy. I think that actually shifts us into a question that I can direct towards you. What is the role of the teacher in effective online learning? And you've been in my 300 program where on a Friday at 1 o'clock, a group of 10, it might just be you, me, and one person on the screen because others are working or not in the space. How do you as the teacher still create this embodied experience for those that are present, as well as those that might be watching it on a recording? So please, would you give us some thoughts?
Yeah, and that has been one of the highlights of my teaching experience, especially throughout COVID, to drop into Kiesha's wonderful advanced training once a month for the past year. So I wanted to begin by just saying what embodied philosophy means to me. And the first word that came to mind is balance. And also synergy. It allows me to bring my full self into the teaching and learning space. And I also consider myself a student even as I'm teaching, because I'm always learning, more and more things. And by my full self, I mean, I can bring my intellectual curiosity and my heartfelt curiosity and my body, like it can all be there. And I think that's kind of rare, actually. And I'm going to talk about different kinds of educational spaces that lean more in one of those directions than the others, whereas embodied philosophy welcomes it all. And using this term that Jacob, the founder of embodied philosophy, sometimes uses, a synergy. It's really the synergy where all of those different approaches to knowing are mutually enhancing. And so while I really enjoy that, it makes me feel really at home in embodied philosophy. I try to create an experience where other people see that that's possible and they yearn for it and they can also know it. So embodied philosophy online learning is probably quite different than many other learning environments, such as business school or something else, because we as teachers create a space in which people can know that synergy between mind, heart, body, and soul. And we want to show people that these various approaches to learning are, like I said, mutually enhancing. And I want people to get a glimpse of it and really yearn for it, and then really own it and know it in this embodied way. And so I have two examples to show how that can be done. There are a lot of people who have a beautiful devotional practice, but it's not necessarily grounded in the history of the tradition. And it can be really empowering to know the history of your tradition or your parampara so that you actually know where you come from. So is my tradition 5,000 years old? You know, there's this rumor that yoga is 5,000 years old. Well, is it? And so I teach the history class as part of the certification program in embodied philosophy. And we really look at this very pervasive rumor to figure out, well, which part of it is 5,000 years old and which part of it was invented sort of yesterday? Because there's a lot of romanticized rumors and you don't want to be sort of stuck in someone's version of what happened when it was really not grounded in the, facts of what happened. And I've heard a lot of students say how very empowering it is to learn the history, because then they're not going on romanticized rumors, really. Like, oh, he said, she said, okay, I'll just trust so-and-so. But then you encounter some book that really shows that the history of my tradition was otherwise, and it can be very, very disconcerting. So much so that I've had a few people say that they've had not like a full-blown panic attack, thankfully, but it's really like pulling the rug out from beneath you when you find out that things are not as they were advertised to be. And so we have this year-long history class where people get grounded in the history as much as possible. And I co-teach the class with this wonderful colleague friend. His name is Ramesh. And we actually model different versions of what happened historically. We don't always agree on every single thing, which helps people understand that history is a story, and we get into all sorts of contested histories. And I quote one woman who says that when she was in her 200-hour training, she was just kind of believing what she had heard, but then she really studied more and she thought, oh my gosh, this is amazing. I actually know for myself. And so I really think that getting grounded in the history is a form of yoga, because it's disciplined knowledge, and people really enjoy that. Sometimes gurus make stuff up. They say that, oh, my lineage goes back to such and such and such and such. Well, there was just an article published about, I'm not going to pick on anyone in particular, but that really shows that the lineage was not actually what he said it was. So it's really great to get grounded in as many facts as possible. It's very empowering. It's earned knowledge. And so this, like I said, is really an expression of yoga. And on the flip side, there are people who have a lot of knowledge about devotional traditions, which can be very dry if they're not also experiencing a heart awakening through the meditation practice that is described within these various different devotional traditions. Or if they don't actually go to chants or do something to really live it, then it's just kind of like you're talking about what's happened, but not grounding it in the embodied experience. So here again, these are two different examples coming from each direction, I think, of how embodied philosophy offers this synergy and balance. So I started out in academia, and there was a real emphasis on the fact that we are to be scholars of religion. And there was a lot of emphasis put on the word of, because we should be separate from the thing we're studying, right? Like, don't go native, don't actually do this stuff because you might lose your mind. Just study about it, like what all those other people do. And so I kind of partially bought into that. And I thought, well, gosh, if I meditate, maybe I'll lose my mind. Maybe this will just be a terrible thing. And, so I'd love to hear your thoughts about that. And so there's really not that much room in academia to welcome the other parts of ourselves. It's really mostly all maybe about the mind, although I'm sure it differs in different environments slightly. And also, we're distinct from seminaries. Not all, I'm sure there's a lot of variation, obviously, but there's not that much room for questioning in a lot of environments where people are studying religion. They don't necessarily want to hear questions from doubters. They're probably viewed as provocateurs and maybe, sent home. But in embodied philosophy, we welcome all the questions. Just ask away, and we can discuss, and teachers are open to hearing students' questions. And then also, embodied philosophy is not exactly the communities that are it's all good. You know, those spiritual communities, it's all good. Well, you know, it's not all good, right? So it's important to discern, and I bring in this Sanskrit word viveka, which means discernment. It's very important to discern between the good and the not so good. Who is an accomplished teacher and who is a manipulative teacher? Should I go to this place? Should I go to that place? Looping back to Stephanie's focus on community, like which is the enhancing community? They're not all good. And so I think that is important, and we are definitely able to focus on that in embodied philosophy, and the teachers show up with an interest in focusing on that. So my role as a teacher, and I think everyone's role as a teacher, is to support learners who are active participants and also blossoming leaders. They're students, but also leaders in their own right. And we want to offer this sense of belonging where people can feel like they are also on the path to becoming teachers, or to becoming, you know, even more advanced teachers. So like someone else said earlier, at the beginning of COVID, I had like a lot of doubt. I thought, oh gosh, this online thing is not going to be, it's not going to be great. It's going to be really limiting. But somewhere along the way, probably a few months into Kiesha's training, I thought, oh my gosh, this is the schnizzle. Like, this is it. Wow, this is incredible. People sharing, people learning, people questioning, people crying, people getting angry, like it's all there. It was a very emotional space, even while it was completely intellectual at the same time. And I'm actually getting chills just thinking about it. I mean, it really can embrace the whole person, I think. So we have this expansive classroom where people can come from all over the world. And we did have one student from Senegal, and the connection was amazing. I wouldn't have known that she was, you know, so far away. She looked as close as anybody else. And so these Zoom windows can be really intimate spaces. It's expansive because it's everybody from around the world, and yet it's very intimate because we're looking at each other, maybe even more so than in a large lecture hall where you cannot even see who's in the back, right? So you can help loop people in by making eye contact, by moving. Like as a teacher, I like to move in the window. I'm not just kind of like a statue. And I nod and I acknowledge people, and they acknowledge me back sometimes. And I think that the teacher can be aware of where people are, like what's their mood. You can really notice that. And okay, so moving forward a little bit, how can we make the Zoom space interactive? So it's not just a one directional transmission, but really this bi-directional interactive gaze almost. And so here I'm thinking a little bit about the Sanskrit word darshan, which means seeing. So we can see each other in a bi-directional way as we are together in this space. So with respect to the five senses, so we can really see each other. We can really look at each other. And the fact that we are all sitting not in a classroom, most likely in our homes, maybe in our offices or somewhere, and we have this background, like what do people choose to put in the background? It kind of, to me, softens the professional barrier. And so Zoom is kind of works very well with embodied philosophy, which is softening boundaries. It's not like mind only or body only. It's the synergy between the two. And so here we're offering very complete education, a rigorous education, really. And it's softened by the fact that we're all coming from home, and sometimes we hear the dogs barking and the 12-year-old shows up in the window, which has definitely happened to me as well. One time I even saw my cat walking outside my window, and I was like horrified because the cat is not supposed to be outside, but you know, what am I going to do about it? But like all these things happen. And so it really makes us all human to one another. So what we see, I think, brings us together. All right, and I also talked a little bit about hearing, you know, the children show up talking, the dogs are barking. In teaching, we can use music. And I think that that really helps bring people together. And I also use a lot of intentional silences, just an intentional pause or a silence, or just even a full-blown 5 minutes of silence for people to think on their own before we come back together as a group, can be very helpful to create an interactive space. As far as touch is concerned, lots of guided meditations. You know, how do you feel inside? A teacher can really show up, and I see Caitlin nodding a little bit. So, you know, how do people feel inside? Are we calm or are we stiff? And teachers can facilitate that awareness for students in a Zoom space. All right, so touch. I follow this one guy, not anymore because I'm trying not to be too much on social media, but there's one teacher who offers something called the simultaneous sip. And every morning he gives a talk and everybody takes a sip of their coffee at the same moment. And I gotta tell you, it's really fun. It's great. You know, everyone's experiencing the coffee at that moment. And when I watch the recording, it's not quite as powerful because I know the moment has actually passed for everybody else. But really, a simultaneous sip of warm coffee? I've never led a class with that, but as I was preparing for my contribution today, I thought of that and I might, try it. It's a real way to help everybody get embodied. And then with respect to smell, we can invite people to bring their favorite essential oil or scented candle into the classroom just to make sure that they are in a comfortable space. And then innovations that online teaching offers, I've had a bunch of really, really pleasant surprises. And the first one that really comes to mind is the chat box, because it allows me to hear what people are thinking and the questions that they have as they show up on the chat box. And I can manage looking at that while I'm teaching. And so I can integrate people's ideas or answers to those questions in the moment, if I can, but that could not happen outside of the online learning space because someone would actually have to talk to me in the classroom, which would be, disruptive or maybe even a little bit rude. But here we, accomplished teachers can focus on what we're talking about and also kind of glance at the chat box. And so it's an incredible way for us to connect with that nonverbal communication in the chat box. And also I use the chat box to throw in usually a lot of Sanskrit words. And so just random things that come up that might not be in my slides, I can put in the chat box. And it would be a little bit more difficult maybe to do that in real life, actually. So that is the chat box, which of course is viewable later, because if the class is recorded, then people can go back and look at the chat box, which is part of the saved content. The breakout rooms, I really love. I think some people don't enjoy speaking to a large group, whatever that might be. It could be 10 people, it could be 100 people. I think a few studies have shown that some people participate more because of the breakout rooms. You get in a room with 2 or 3 people, you feel a little more safe and more willing to interact. And I think it's a real invitation to people who might be a little bit shy or apprehensive about sharing in front of a group. So I love the breakout rooms. And I also love when people sort of reappear from their breakout rooms. I just think it's really fascinating, sort of metaphysically, like people are just kind of re-arriving in this interesting sort of way. Using the reactions is wonderful. When people give you, the thumbs up or the heart gesture, I think it's just something, it's another kind of nonverbal communication that is a wonderful, there we go, surprising way for us to be able to say, I hear you and I see you going in both directions, which is really not so possible in real life. Screen sharing is wonderful. It's a great way to bring a lot of multimedia into the classroom. It's very efficient and has enhanced my own teaching. And now when I go back into a yoga studio, I think, well, where's my presentation? How am I gonna, I haven't actually integrated that in the actual classroom because it involves like a lot of organization, I guess, like how am I going to project this on the wall in the studio and that kind of thing. So it is very efficient here in the online learning space. And the fact that the classes are usually recorded is very helpful because I think it takes a burden off of people to feel like, oh my gosh, I got to hear it all now or else it's going to be lost. You can always go back if you have time and watch the recording to learn more, to take notes. And I think it's a wonderful thing when teachers can offer the recording so that people can listen to it again and again. And I know in Embodied philosophy, the recordings are yours to keep forever. So I think that's a real blessing of the online learning space. To create more interaction, sometimes people use polls, just a random sort of thing like, how much did you enjoy this topic that we just talked about? And people can put their answers in. And it's just kind of a fun way to interact with one another. And then at the end of our sessions, or sometime in the middle, sometimes we take a group photo and they're so cute. Everyone waves or you put a heart and we like click screenshot right away. And much to my surprise at the beginning, I really enjoy those photos. It's a nice memento of our time together. And I always send photos to people after we're together. Speaking of which, we could even do that today, right? If everybody wants to turn their camera on later, maybe. So these are some innovations in online learning that I think a lot of the teachers use. And I would love to hear from everybody about what you use, what you don't use, any reflections or comments or criticisms of any of these methods. Like, is there a downside to any of this? Would love to hear all that. And in closing, I think I'll just also pose one other question, which is what theoretical or ethical issues should be discussed with respect to the online globalization of Asian traditions. We talk a lot about cultural borrowing and sharing and appreciation and appropriation. And I think that there's a little tweak to it when we're doing all of this online. And I just think that that's maybe worth discussing. So I think I would love to hear from any of you about any of those ideas that I just mentioned that overlap just a bit with Stephanie's. And I think hopefully there's a synergy between the two topics.
And that could be in the chat with a thumbs up, a heart, coming off of mute, whether you're on camera or not. And one thing I'll share with you, Dr. Marcy, that could lead to Dr. Raj sharing about the role of a teacher in these online spaces is what I experienced from you. I've been with you in person more than virtually, but in this virtual space, using all the tools that you shared, like the chat, like music, like the pauses, what I felt was that you were telling a story. Like you were bringing us a movie with the information versus just the facts, just the timeline, stuff that we would traditionally get in the in-person spaces. So storytelling seems to be something that is coming out of the teacher, or even myself, I feel like I'm a performer now. There's a complete package that needs to come in versus me just showing up with the knowledge that's, in my space. So Dr. Raj or Dr. Marcy, if you want to add on to showing up as the
Yeah, sure. So I can share what seems to resonate with students, at least students of mine, whether at embodied philosophy or anywhere really. So storytelling is something I teach about. So I study and teach about the stories of ancient India, right? There's a course at embodied philosophy starting tomorrow, in fact, decoding 20 key stories from ancient India and how they're related to yoga poses. But in addition to storytelling being the subject of what I teach, storytelling is also the manner in which I teach. It's also the pedagogical platform with which I teach. If I were to teach science, anything, the best physicists in the world are the ones who can tell an accessible story about the nature of physical reality. So this is what draws a reader in. It's storytelling. When one is telling a story about the data. So that's a really important pedagogical tool, at least for me, because I teach about the stories, then I tell the stories live, but also in presenting academic content or any content, I tell a story around the content so that the mind can engage it quite readily. Another pedagogical tool, an online tool that seems to resonate is now, in addition to the courses that I do this sort of community event. Just the last month and a half, I sensed there was major trouble coming. So I started, and here we are, we're in the middle of it. I started these events called Wisdom Wednesdays. They're not course specific, they're drop-ins. They're perhaps similar to traditional satsangs, but with an innovation that we all have a discussion at the end. And the wisdom teachings might be from a text or from something that's going on in the world right now. And at the outset, people really want the chanting. People want the chanting in everything I do. But now what we do is something I do with one-on-one clients, which is a guided meditation. And that can be quite powerful for creating a unity and a synergy. Everyone's having a guided experience together at the same time. The group really gels. I mean, sometimes we gel in a way that people don't always gel in a room with each other. And so those two things come to mind. The third thought that come to mind is a little bit of a nerdy joke, but breakout rooms for me is like Star Trek beaming up and beaming down. You're teleportation, you're beaming someone immediately from one room to another. Anyhow, TMI. There you go.
You got some laugh emojis if you didn't see that, Dr. Raj.
Yes, I'll assume they're laughing with me because I'm laughing, but that's good.
Stephanie, we'd love to hear your voice in this space.
Thanks. Yeah, I like this question that Raj put into the chat of what do you like or expect from an online teacher? And it made me think about something that Marcy said with regards to the, the advantage of being able to record. And because I'm, one of the co-directors of the certificate program, I try to, and I think I'm pretty sure, Marcy, you do a lot of this also, of just trying to watch other instructors' talks. And so I've noticed a real difference between what's a really good recorded lecture and what makes a really good interactive class. And it's kind of two different things sometimes, where sometimes the conversational piece that really gels the interactive experience when you're not there live, like the sip of, like the simultaneous sip, it loses a bit of its magic after the fact. So as a recorded event, when somebody, when you have students in a certain kind of lively conversation, if you're just listening to it later, it's like, oh, I kind of, missed out on that. Whereas if you actually show up, it's maybe more meaningful. So that's kind of an interesting, I find when I'm listening to, especially if it's a kind of a newer topic or a lecture on a text that I'm trying to research and understand better, and someone's giving a talk on it. I love that, PowerPoint, good slides, outline, because I want that, the grit, the real information on it. And it's, I'm listening to it in my own time, and I can take notes and look up page numbers and all of that kind of stuff. But the classes that have, that I get feedback from students on, the teachers that the students love in the certificate program tend to be the times when, there's that real interactive component. Students are reading part of the text out loud together. There's pauses for discussion. So it's, it's kind of it's just an interesting facet. And, there's not a right or a wrong way. They're just two different components of the same thing. One doesn't work quite as well as for after the fact.
Can I quickly share something that came to mind that's very important, but I think many of us just assume it at this point. Right now, we're engaged in a live experience. There are portions of online courses and entire online courses that are recorded and you consume it in your own time. I think there's advantages to both, but from my personal pedagogical preference in terms of what I see as most impactful, there's always a live dimension included. For the sake of community and for the sake of transmission, sometimes I'll get a question on chat, and I welcome students to they'll watch a module, they'll share a question, and I may say, okay, I'm going to address that live in tutorial, because so much more will come in the moment with them teasing out exactly what they're asking. And even if they're not in tutorial, I'll address it live so they can have a sort of a live answer. When I started at the OCHS, the Oxford Center for Hindu Studies, they weren't doing live Zoom tutorials, but that didn't matter to me. I just went ahead and held my own, because for me, it's crucial pedagogically to have an experience. And I think in many ways it can make for a very different type of online course. So that's one piece I wanted to sort of articulate, although I imagine most of us have internalized the importance of that.
And that actually gets back to something else that I was thinking about with respect to expectations, I guess. To what extent should we require people to participate? I hesitate to
for me personally, it'll vary from space to space, and it'll be based on the culture of the space, the comfort level of the students, the contract that we engage in at the beginning. But for me, in my tutorials, it's cameras on. That's if you're not for that level of intimacy and transmission, if you're not seated and watching fully, then you're not going to, the hose is spraying. So you're going to be sitting there to receive and share. And so in those settings, it's cameras on. Like nobody comes to those tutorials with their cameras off, because then it means they're not fully present in that dynamic. Mm-hmm. In many ways, I've been to many talks, and with my camera off for a variety of reasons. So it's understandable that people have different thresholds, but it's a huge difference when you could see someone's face. Huge.
Yeah, it is. And then should teachers sort of make a blanket statement at the beginning of a class saying, we expect you to participate in the conversations 5 times throughout the duration of this class, or is that too rigid? These are just, I think, questions that can be raised to, to discuss. And I see that Kiesha has her hands up.
I like to use the technology, Dr. Marcy. Yes. So my experience, based upon what Dr. Raj just shared, I did a 12-week meditation program during COVID, and it was a requirement that we were on camera. And in the beginning, it was like, oh my goodness, I got to pick up my kid during this time. And what it turned out to be is I made the time for it. I reshifted things, I prioritized, and it was, they said cameras on. If you missed one session, you lost out. I made it a priority. So going into my teachings at Bennett College, where we're half virtual, half remote, or half virtual, half in person, I put in the syllabus, when we're virtual, you need to be on camera in order to get your participation grade. Out of 18 students, I still have only 4 students choosing to be on camera. So they're like willingly reducing the grade by not being on camera. Then when I'm in more, I guess, yoga communal spaces, 200 trainings, 300 trainings, everyone's on camera. Everyone's on camera. Stephanie, kids are flying by, waving, husbands are getting groceries, all these type of things. And we're learning from what we're seeing in the background, right? We're like, what's that book on your shelf, Dr. Marcy? And it starts a whole conversation about more wisdom. So on camera, off camera definitely has its benefits and disadvantages, but I have been in spaces where it's been required. And if that's what you want, you go towards it. So what I like to think of, which kind of shifts into one of the other questions, the role of a student in these spaces. For me, we have so much options, so much information, especially in yoga studies. And as most of us know, Dr. Marcy, Dr. Raj, Stephanie, it really is optional. These aren't requirements that we need for our teaching, for our jobs. It's all optional. So if we're choosing to be in the space, intentionally showing up to be a student versus being connected to the computer, right? Letting the computer drive your experience, let yourself as the student drive the experience and get out of it what you need. And Dr. Raj, I'll pass it back to you. Example, I connected to Dr. Raj through Embodied Philosophy, and I was live with the Ganesh. No, I watched that on replay. I got pulled in by Dr. Raj. So what I did, I stalked Dr. Raj and I signed up for other free courses. But it was also through my live connection with Dr. Raj to build this that I felt the embodiment of what I learned on my own in his tutorials. So that added element of being in person with someone, even if it's just a formal email coming across from Dr. Raj, giving me information, helps me to better connect to the information. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. Yeah, it's so interesting for me. I mean, technically I'm an entrepreneur, but frankly, I'm a teacher and healer, and entrepreneurship is how I can do it, find a way to find my students and sustain the service that I'm doing, what I'm born to do. And so for me, every entrepreneurial online marketing digital coach will tell me to go figure out a funnel where I'm tapping cold traffic. I don't. Because if people come to my courses because they feel the power of the live transmission in a talk, in a coffee shop, wherever. And so it's a little bit different than some models, but the reason why it's worked is because they can discern immediately something is going on in the live transmission that they can't quite get. And I'm sure there are many teachers in embodied philosophy who have something similar and perhaps even better, the ability to connect in the moment with someone. One thing that comes to mind is, rather than frame it in terms of requirements, which can sort of rub people a certain way, what comes to mind for me is like, if I'm teaching a credit class at a university, that's a specific experience that one can expect. If I'm teaching this class starting tomorrow in embodied philosophy, where it's live storytelling, wisdom teachings, esoterica, it's a certain kind of experience that you can expect. for you to expect that experience, you have to be part of that experience. I can't be open and intimate with you if you're a big black box. And if you want that power, then you have to be part of that transmission. So it's a question of what people, what kind of experience people want, understanding what the toll is to drive along that bridge. Just some ideas about reframing is all.
Dr. Marcy, I'm watching your nonverbals. Are you reaching to unmute?
I was actually, yeah, didn't want to cut anybody else off, but thank you for noticing. I think this is such an important point, and I think that there is a difference between the college environment with very young adults and then the adult learning environment, such as embodied philosophy, where everyone's really choosing to be there. And so to what extent should we structure the space with the requirement to have the camera on or to add something to the chat box? I'm finding myself shifting as we're having this discussion, because I think I came in earlier or previously, to this moment. I thought, well, I don't want to demand too much of people. I don't want to turn them off. But now I'm thinking maybe with embodied philosophy, we could maybe add a little more requirement to show up at X number of live classes with your camera on. And maybe that will help people achieve more of an experience, kind of like what Kiesha was saying. She made it work because it was required in that meditation training that she took, and people will maybe need that little bit of extrinsic sort of push to show up. That'll serve them really well, and it'll work out great.
Thank you, Dr. Marcy. Dr. Raj puts in the chat, the majority of my undergrads feel the same way.
As Marcia's comment, sorry.
Oh, thank you. A comment from Marcia, the majority of my undergrads feel the same way. And as a teacher, it makes sense to let students prioritize what makes the most uncomfortable experience for them.
Yeah, Marcia was saying that sometimes it's more comfortable with the camera off, and I certainly can relate to that. And so I don't think there should be pressure for anybody who may not be in a safe space or may not be in a comfortable space or may be feeling self-conscious or who knows what. And I think comfort has to be respected. That's a different situation where it's a requirement getting on. Like, one understands that it's a requirement of the program to have your camera on for whatever reason.
Mm-hmm. Caitlin puts in the chat, our intentions matter. We get out what we put in. As the student, yeah.
I thought, because I know we're running towards the end of our time, I wanted to just to add in a dimension that we haven't talked about, because we've had a lot of conversation about how kind of the online space works with Zoom. Another virtual element of learning and sharing knowledge might be something like what embodied philosophy is doing with the Tarka journal. And so I just thought I'd mention that because I happen to edit and direct the Tarka journal I help bring in, and I've had pieces. Marcy's been a regular contributor to that journal as well. And it's actually a space where we've hoped to combine this idea of the scholar and the practitioner, and invited kind of what happens after you finish that that year-long certificate program or that immersive experience of being that we've recently been publishing I've been editing and reading through a number of former Loyola Marymount University MA students have contributed work to the Tarka Journal. And that's, Chris Chappell's been a really wonderful support. He's also regularly contributed to that journal. So it's been a conflux of kind of more senior teachers and newer scholars and fresh thinking, both kind of PhD level and people that are really entrenched in practice and have something to offer from that perspective, and bringing those voices together so that it's not just strictly a peer-reviewed academic journal, but that it can also be something that relates on the practice level. So I don't mean to just plug my own project, but I think the reason I'm bringing it up is kind of the vision of it was to have a place to continue the conversations after you have the virtual online learning experience. Where do you go from there to connect back? And so something like when I logged on last night to hear the plenary talks, and I saw some common faces that I had recognized from other conferences, and it's like, oh, that's comforting to see. So, you know, these different people that I've gotten to know over the years at different conferences, and they're showing up. It's, you know, this is a place where we can continue to share thought. And so, yeah, thank you, Kiesha, for putting that into the chat. And if any of you, you know, want to peek at that and take a look at upcoming, those of you that are here today, I just invite you to consider contributing. We hope to grow that as a place to continue conversation beyond. And we actually have, you know, an issue coming out on teaching. We hope to have a actual conference at Embodied Philosophy in the next year that will be on pedagogy and on teaching, where we can have, you know, different people come in and speak and have some more conversation about this. So I'll close with that.
I thank you for bringing it up, Stephanie, because again, as a student of embodied philosophy, having these other tools as reminders that the conversation can keep going. So I could then take it into the journal a year after I did the course and still continue to grow and learn, and also connect to those people that are publishing and finding their materials as well. So those other vehicles like newsletters and the reminder messages, and that meditation training that I had mentioned, that was a 12-week, they continued throughout the entire year after that. Sangha check-ins, informal things. If you can join in, you join in, and then they send a recording. And even though I don't make them all, it's still the reminder that the knowledge is out there, the community's out there, the work's being done, and I can always re-engage in when I need those tools.
If I'm not mistaken, Kiesha, we have like about 10 minutes or so, correct? Is that correct?
We are under the 10-minute mark, Dr. Raj, yes.
Got it. I was just going to say, I mean, now's your chance. We're all live on the call, whatever's comfortable for you. What questions you have, you must have questions, comments. Maybe feel free to maybe even type them privately if you prefer, or publicly, or just unmute.
Thank you, Caitlin. 8 minutes. Yes. And in the beginning, I also mentioned, if you happen to have question about yoga, because this is a forum about online studies and everyone here in Embodied Philosophy is tapped into yoga in some form or fashion, we'd be open to those questions as well. Thank you, Dr. Raj, sharing the course that's coming up in regards to decoding the myths behind 20 key yoga poses. And I believe that's scheduled 4 weeks, right? Giving you time to digest the material, also recorded. And then the platform that Embodied Philosophy uses has capability for chatting and commenting about the materials. I'm definitely one when it comes into how do we create the space, the community embodiment. I am always open to just inquiring. And please, if you don't wish to speak, don't feel like you have to. Igor, I appreciate you being visually present. Anything that you'd like to share about online learning, about the information we've shared?
Thank you for calling. It is interesting conversation for me because I also have an experience of working online recently because of pandemic. I'm teaching not yoga, but I'm teaching fine arts, and everything what you are sharing now in this room was very interesting and important for me. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Igor. I appreciate you sharing. Caitlin, is there anything that you could share with us as a student, graduate, supporting this program, this training, what the students are experiencing when it comes to online learning, what's working, what's not working, or just your personal experience?
Yeah, I mean, I have to agree with what's been discussed already. I think you all articulated it beautifully. For me, it was, as I mentioned, it was a challenge, sort of adjusting to completely online, especially teaching and doing yoga and whatnot. But at the same time, it's also opened so many doors, not just technologically, but being able to connect with individuals from all around the world. And in that way, it's been incredibly lovely. I did a Jane summer 3-week course last summer, and it the time difference was a little different. It was a little hard to adjust, but I mean, it was wonderful just being able to talk to people I would never have been able to meet had we not been online. So thank you.
Thank you for sharing, Caitlin. Definitely have space for a few more questions. While questions roll in, Stephanie, Dr. Marcy, Dr. Raj, any last embodied words of wisdom you want to share in this space?
We live in the information age. Information is abundant. I suppose part of that is ideally being able to vet the information that's being received. Instructors ought not be talking in Wikipedia articles, and students ought not be passive Wikipedia readers. Right? There's no shortage of information at your fingertips. So I would encourage you, whether through embodied philosophy or elsewhere, whatever that looks like, to harness the information, realize the information, to have an embodied experience with your learning.
Thank you, Dr. Marcy. Any parting words?
It's just been really informative, and I love hearing from the students. Would welcome more feedback all the time around, what works best for you, what doesn't. Obviously, we've raised so many wonderful issues, cameras on, cameras off. The extent to which we should structure space for people obviously depends upon the audience, whether it's the undergraduate university class or meditation experience with adults who are paying for the course. The audience is really different, and even what works for one person one day might not work for the other. So to what extent should we provide structure as opposed to not, is just something that I suppose we can keep thinking about, especially with the embodied philosophy program. When I teach, I know there's usually about 20 people live, but there's more like 70 people in the class. So I don't get to know all those people. And I wonder if we should make some kind of loose requirement, like you should please join 3 out of the 12 classes live. Maybe that would be a way to mediate between no structure and too much structure, because like somebody said, I might not be in the mood to have my camera on. It might feel threatening. I think Marcia said something about that, and it's very comfortable just to kind of be in a more private space, and you can even listen better if you're feeling self-conscious. So there's a lot of pros and cons. So I wonder to what extent we can adjust the way we do it at Embodied Philosophy. And I think that this conversation has been really fruitful, and I would love to hear more from people afterwards.
Thank you, Dr. Marcy. Stephanie, I know you're taking a bunch of notes on different things that you might be able to integrate into some of Embodied Philosophy's program. Could you give us some parting words?
I just want to thank all of you for making the time to be here. I know that clearly not everyone that showed up today was ready to engage in the conversation in the way we kind of had set this out, envisioning and hoping for conversation, and it's been rich just being able to hear and debate the topics with those that were ready to do that. But just want to open up that for those that might want to send a note afterwards, I'll just put my email in the chat if anyone wants to follow up or with any comments or thoughts or engagement. I'd love to hear it after the fact as well.
And with 1 minute to spare, my parting words would be thank you for allowing me to moderate the space, students participating. You could have been anywhere else. And I'm going to give the shameless plug like Dr. Marcy. And if you're willing to come on camera and take one of these Zoom photos, yeah, nostalgia, yeah, fun, but it also helps to spread the word. So Dr. Marcy's going to post it on her Instagram, and it's going to say, yes, there's still people in Zoom conferences on Saturdays. There's still space for you to go find community. So thank you, Carol, for jumping on the screen. Anyone else want to jump on? Cats, dogs? All right. We will say embodied philosophy. 1, 2.
Oh, wait. Hold on 1 second. I need to get myself organized here. So yeah, we can say embodied philosophy. Waves sometimes look awesome. If you want to time it well, these reactions stay on for a healthy 5 seconds. So, oh, I love your little gadget there. It's adorable. All right. And if anybody whose screen is off would like to turn it on, you may. And obviously you don't have to. And so thanks to everybody for your wonderful smile. Here we go. All right, I took a couple and I will send it. Where shall I send it so that everybody, if you want to get a copy of the photo, maybe put your email in the chat box right now. It's a great memento.
Caitlin, is there any announcements you need to make to conference participants?
I just want to thank you all for joining us today. This was a very informative discussion and I really enjoyed it. At first, I really wasn't knowing what to expect, but it's been lovely. And I'm so grateful to have met you all virtually. So I would love to keep in touch with you all. I will be graduating this semester and I plan to branch out. So embodied philosophy is definitely something that I am interested in. So thank you.
Excellent. Just quickly for the presenter, Stephanie, Kiesha have said yes, but Marcy, if you'd like, we'll briefly meet after in my Zoom room just to decompress. That might be great. I'll send you the link while I have you. Thank you all very much.
Thank you all.
Thank you.